Hello and welcome to the Warwick Words Digital History Festival. Well, we're devastated that our plans this year have been cancelled because of the pandemic. But we're very lucky that so many of our authors have agreed to deliver their talks directly to you in the comfort of your own home. I'm delighted to hand over now to a Warwick Words favourite, here to talk about his latest book, The Good State. Please enjoy this fantastic talk by Professor C Grayling.
Thank you very much indeed, and hello to you all. I'm going to talk to you, if I may, about what the very concept of democracy implies. There's a general point to be made about it and a particular point. The general point is about the idea that democracy is government by the people, for the people, and what that really means, because actually it's a very rich idea, rich in consequences when you've worked them out. And the particular point I want to make is about the Westminster model of democracy. As the name implies, it's something which is developed from the Westminster Parliament here in the UK, but it exists either in direct or in descended form in over 50 countries in the world. And if there's a problem at the heart of the Westminster model, and there are a couple of very big problems with it, then those problems are a risk for those countries that work the model. And the argument that I want to offer to you is that the very nature of the Westminster model subverts the purposes for which democracy, when you dig into the concept, into the meaning of democracy, for which democracy exists. Well, you'll remember famously in November 1863, Abraham Lincoln, in his Gettysburg Address after the terrible battle in which so many people died, said that the North of the United States was fighting to protect and to promote democracy, rule of the people, by the people, for the people. That was his definition, and that is the definition which wonderfully encapsulates in a very pithy, very concise way what the fundamental idea is. And the great irony is that at the time that Lincoln gave that definition of democracy, the only people in the United States of America who had the vote were white men who owned property. And they were a very, very small group of people. So the concept of the people, government by the people, the franchise there was a very restricted notion. And therefore the phrase, the people, in the part of this definition which says by the people, didn't really apply to all the people, although government of the people, government for the people, in that case, the phrase the people meant everybody. So two questions arise when one thinks about this definition. If government is for the people, meaning all the people, then it implies that it should be inclusive. It should be in the interests and for the benefit of everybody in the state, everybody in the society. And that has implications too, because if you think about political arrangements in which competing factions struggle with one another to get their hands on the levers of power so that they can get their agenda through, there's no guarantee that the resulting government is going to be for all the people inclusively. And indeed, very, very familiarly, when we look at the kinds of policies which are put into operation by right-wing governments and left-wing governments, they have a definite bias in line with a certain set of interests that motivate their political agenda. This is a point that I'll come back to in a moment. But the point about government by the people and who this much more restricted concept of the people is, who are the ones who have the franchise? Well, let us remember that it is less than 100 years since in the United Kingdom, women had the vote on the same terms as men. Women were given the vote in 1919 after the First World War because of the great contribution they'd made to the war effort, but only to women aged 30 and over. This was on the rather condescending view by that age, women would have, I don't know, grown a brain cell or two or learned how to read a newspaper. It was only in 1928 that finally men and women had votes at the same age. And only in about 1968 that eventually the voting age was lowered to 18. Now, there is, in my view, a very strong argument, and if I have an opportunity to put that argument to you, for lowering the voting age even further, in my view, to 16. At 16, people can marry, can join the army, they can do plenty of other things. And they also, by that age, understand perfectly well what's at issue in the country and how they might be affected by it. And that's an argument, therefore, for saying that the voting age should be extended even further. But that's a controversial matter and not really central to what I want to say. So let's get back to the question about the franchise. Whatever the franchise is and whatever the voting age begins and whoever is included in it, it's obvious that if government is by the people, for the people, then the franchise should be as general, as extensive as possible. Now that is something which on the whole, over the last century and more, has been realized in most of the countries we think of as democratic. So that is, again, so also is the fact that the ballot in most elections is secret, the fact that putatively anyway, theoretically, information is available to voters about policy proposals that different political parties put forward. So in those respects, you might think that what we think of as the advanced democracies of the world are legitimately describable as democracies. But now we come to the point about government for the people, and the implication of a democracy being something in which government is a service which is inclusive and which acts in the interests of the state, of the populace as a whole. And let me leave that just hanging for a moment, because I now want to look at the Westminster model in order to explain to you why it is that that model actually subverts that very, very important commitment of the concept of democracy. And let me take the UK as the central example. By the way, you may be surprised to know that the United States is actually a version of the Westminster model with an important adaptation. India, Canada, like the UK, are very similar to the UK system. Places like Australia, New Zealand, and others have slightly adapted or modified it, but some of the fundamentals remain. So let's have a look at what happens in the UK system. The UK system is the result of what happened in 1688, after James II abdicated and Parliament invited William of Orange to come and be king. Now, you may remember that before that time, kings claimed to rule by divine right. They were appointed by the deity. That was the source of their authority in the state. Very tenuous idea for an age which was becoming less inclined to a religious outlook on the world. But in any case, in 1688, Parliament adopted the role of the deity by appointing the king, and the king, the new king, ruled by grace of Parliament, not by grace of God. And it happened that in the succeeding half century or so, this arrogation of the privileges and prerogatives, the powers of the crown into Parliament became very extensive. Remember, George I, and the first king of the Hanoverian succession, couldn't speak English, therefore took no part in cabinet discussions. And the cabinet, therefore, drawn, of course, from Parliament, became the effective executive power in the kingdom. It was no longer the monarch who was the executive power, but the people drawn from Parliament who constituted the government of the day. And they, of course, governed by courtesy of having the majority of support in Parliament. So it has become a feature of the Westminster model that governments consist of people drawn from the majorities in Parliament. Now let us think what that means. That means that a very, very important principle, one which was insisted upon by John Locke in his treatises on government, and by Baron Montesquieu, the great French political theorist of the 18th century, and which was adopted by the founders of the United States of America, the principle of the separation of powers. So the powers of the executive and the powers of the legislature ought to be separate so that the legislature can control and hold the executive to account. If these powers lie in the same hands, if the executive power is also the legislative power, as was the case in the days of absolute monarchy before 1688, then the person who carries out the laws, enacts the laws, is also the person who makes the laws. Imagine a situation such as obtained indeed in the days of absolute monarchy, where not only were the executive and legislative powers in the same hands, but the judicial powers were in the same hands too. So the king was both the maker of the laws, the actor of the laws, and the judge as to whether the laws had been applied or not. The whole idea behind the 1688 settlement and the theories of Montesquieu and people like Madison and Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson and others as they created a constitution for the new United States was that the powers should be separate so that they can check and balance one another and so that the executive can't just do what it likes. Alas, in the Westminster model, not in the US version of the model, as I say, I'll come back to that, but in the Westminster model, because the executive is drawn from the majority in the legislature, it follows that the legislature is the creature of the executive, not the controller of it, but the body that does the bidding of the executive in voting through the executive's proposals. We see this every day in Parliament with the whipping system. If a government has a majority in Parliament, it whips its majority through and it gets its agenda through. And even if there are opposition parties present in Parliament, if they don't have sufficient number of votes, there is nothing that they can do to hold the executive in check because it controls that majority. And that is indeed what has happened. The Westminster model, because of the way that Parliament took the powers of the Crown and the way that the Crown ceased to be anything other than what was once very well described as the ornamental part of the Constitution, so no longer has any executive function. So it came to be that the majority in Parliament is also the executive in the country. Now, in light of this adoption of the Crown prerogatives, the Crown powers in Parliament, Parliament in the Westminster model is sovereign. It is the sovereign body, and its power is unlimited in an arrangement like the one we have in the UK, where there is no codified constitution which specifies the limits on those powers. So to illustrate this, let me remind you that in about 1883, Sir Leslie Stephen, the father of Virginia Woolf, published a paper, an article, in which he said, our Parliament's sovereignty means that its power is absolute. If it enacted a law that said that all blue-eyed babies should be killed, then that would be the law and we would have to obey. And then he channeled a remark that John Stuart Mill had made about 20 years before in his book, Representative Government, where Mill said, again, talking about the sovereignty of Parliament, he said, our Parliament has sovereign powers, but they would never be exercised or abused because our Parliament is populated by gentlemen. Well, I leave to you to imagine, if imagination is required here, what would happen if our Parliament is not populated by gentlemen and what they might do with those sovereign powers in that case. But the tragedy of Sir Leslie Stephen's remark is that it was exactly 50 years later that in Germany, when the Nazis came to power, the exact analog of legislating the death of blue-eyed babies took place. So there is no guarantee that the people who populate the institutions of government will restrain themselves if those institutions themselves are not limited by law. You were no doubt, all of you, reading Livy in bed yesterday, so you will remember at the beginning of book 2 of his great account of the history of Rome, he pointed out that when the Romans threw out the haughty Tarquins, the kings of Rome, they put in their place the rule of law instead of the rule by men. The idea being that if you have institutions which are clearly and consistently defined, which we understand their powers and what the limits on those powers are, then you are not subject to the arbitrary whim of people. And we are in the UK version of the Westminster model, because if you have a sovereign parliament, if the parliament decides what the majority wants, if the majority forms the government and is the creature of that government, then it is the people, the men and women in government, who decide how things will be. And you don't have a check on them outside an election or a rebellion of MPs in Parliament. By the way, this point was put rather well by a legalist philosopher in ancient China, a man called Han Fei, who lived in the 2nd century BC. And in his book, he tells the story of a farmer who was ploughing his field, in the middle of which stood a tree. And as he was ploughing, he saw hares appear and race across the field and bash into the tree and break its neck. And the farmer was delighted. He took the hare and skinned it and cooked it and ate it, and it was delicious. Indeed, it was so delicious that he threw away his plough and he sat by the tree and waited for another hare to come. And Han Fei said, if you wait for another good emperor to come along, having had one and hoping the next one would be good, you may very well be disappointed. And the story of the farmer and the hare illustrates this point beautifully. So it is laws and institutions, not people, that you require in order to ensure that powers are not abused, that their exercise is limited, constrained, and directed towards the right ends, the ends of serving the people, the interests and the well-being of the people. And that is not the case in the Westminster model, where governments are formed from majorities in parliaments because of the failure of the separation of powers. Now, if you look at the US situation, you see there, they were very impressed by Montesquieu's description of the English settlement of 1688. Montesquieu thought, right, we've got a king, we've got a House of Lords, we've got a House of Commons, and we've got a judiciary. The king is the executive power. The House of Lords and Parliament, even despite the fiction of the crown in Parliament, but the House of Lords and House of Commons are the legislative body, and then you have the judges. So the Americans adopted this. They have a president, they have the Congress, which is the House of Representatives and the Senate, and then they have a judiciary, the Supreme Court and all the other courts. So the model which is meant to instantiate the idea of checks and balances is fundamentally the English model from 1688. Notice I say English rather than British, because of course the UK didn't exist until much later. So in the United States, you do have a separation of powers between executive and legislature, between president and Congress. So that bit of the story is okay. But what you fatally don't have in the United States is a separation of powers between the political process on the one hand and the judiciary on the other. We are seeing, even as I speak, politics skewing the Supreme Court. It wouldn't matter which way it was being skewed, whether it was going to give it a conservative majority for the next 30 years or a left-wing majority for the next 30 years. The point is that the constitution of the Supreme Court is a matter of political choice. And that, of course, has an enormous impact on the society, on public policy, and on its application in the United States, and is a drastic failure of separation of powers there. But underlying all these problems is the source, as it were, the toxin that makes things worse. In the United Kingdom, as in the United States, as in India, as in Canada, as in other Westminster model countries, the electoral system we use is the first past the post electoral system, sometimes called the plurality system. That means that in a constituency, people present themselves for election, and the person who gets the most votes goes to Parliament. Well, it sounds perfectly reasonable, doesn't it? But unfortunately, of course, it isn't. It would only be reasonable if the number of candidates in any constituency were always restricted to 2. If there are more than 2, then the result is distortion. And almost always, it's the case that a person who gets the minority of votes, a minority of overall votes, nevertheless goes to Parliament as representative. Let me give you a simple example. Supposing you have a constituency with 100 voters, and supposing 10 people offer themselves for election. Suppose 8 of them get 10 votes each, one gets 9 votes, and the last gets 11 votes. Well, because the person who got 11 votes got more votes than any other individual candidate, that is the person who goes to Parliament. And the other 89 voters are completely unrepresented in Parliament. And this happens typically in all our elections, that the majority of votes cast in elections are wasted. They're empty, but they don't get any representation in Parliament. In December of last year, the Conservative Party won a massive 80-seat majority over all other parties combined. They did so on 43% of the actual votes cast. So 57% of the actual votes cast have no power in what happens in Parliament. They may be represented there in the form of Labour MPs and Lib Dem MPs, one Green MP, for example, but they cannot control what happens in our sovereign parliament, because having a majority, and especially a very big majority, makes it just a rubber stamping mechanism for the executive. The bigger the majority, the more of a rubber stamping mechanism it is, the more therefore of a zombie parliament it is, a kind of theatre. People make speeches, but the speeches have no effect. The executive will get its way. Now that 43% of the vote cast in favour of Conservative candidates represents 29% of the total electorate. 29% of the total electorate have given the government in power today absolute power in the land to do whatever the other 71% of the population may not like. So when we think about the concept of democracy, government by the people, where the people here must mean as wide an extended franchise as possible, we must surely mean that the people must be properly represented. They must be fairly represented in the legislative body. And this means that the very concept of democracy itself demands that our system of representation be a proportional system of representation. Now, there is no country in the world which has a perfect electoral system or a perfect government. We cannot expect perfection in this world outside the purlieus of Warwick. So when we think to ourselves, what are the better systems than the ones that we have here, better than the system we have in the UK and better than the Westminster model in general, we can look at examples like most of our friends and neighbours in Europe. Look at Germany, for example, or the Netherlands. About 40 of the 43 European countries have systems of proportional representation. And in most of those, in the great majority of them, and the two that I've mentioned are outstanding examples, there is much greater political stability and much better performing economies than in countries in which, like the UK, like India, where if you get a highly partisan government with an agenda which very much favors one side of the argument, then you're going to get a situation where destabilization and problems arise. I mean, think of it. The first past the post system almost always generates a two-party arrangement. It does here in the UK. Third parties are squeezed out and have very, very small representation. It does this in the United States. In fact, in the first past the post system in the United States is so dominant that the congressional districts, the constituencies in the US, hardly ever change hands. Over 90% of them have never changed hands between Democrat and Republican in the last half century and more, which is an extraordinary fact. And it is an artifact of the first past the post way of electing a legislature. So you get a two-party system, and a two-party system has all the problems and perils of what was described by James Madison in the Federalist Papers at the time that the US Constitution was being devised. In fact, it's in Federalist Paper number 10. If you wish to look it up, it's available freely on the internet, where he talks about factionalism. That if you have factions competing with one another, tug of war, trying to get their hands on the levers of power so they can get their own particular agenda through, then the result is going to be division, divisiveness, and the fact that the whole population, the whole country is not going to be served because public policy will always embody the views of one side of the political argument. And that, of course, happens here. In the pendulum swing between left and right. And now, of course, it's extremely difficult for parties of the center and the left because they tend to be rather divided. So you've got divisions between Liberal Democrats and Labour and Plaid and Greens and so forth, whereas on the right you have the Conservative Party, and they prioritize unity and cohesion at election time. And they therefore form governments much more often than other parties do for that reason, and almost always on a minority of the popular vote. It is an urgent matter, therefore, that we should reform our electoral system. And we should also think very seriously about how we understand our system. We have an uncodified constitution. Sometimes people misdescribe it as an unwritten constitution, although in fact parts of our constitution are written in the form of statute. But it's a whole ragbag, a whole mosaic of statutes, and then a lot of traditions and customs and understandings and conventions. In fact, our constitution in the UK has been very well described as a set of understandings that nobody understands, which is incredibly useful to governments. Because if you think about every referendum we've had in this country since 1972, which is when the first one was held, they've all been held on a different basis. That means a lack of clarity and a lack of consistency allows the government of the day to choose how it deals with the election or with the outcome of a referendum. Go back to 2016, the EU referendum. 37% of the total electorate of this country advised the government, because it was an advisory referendum, to leave the EU. 37% of the total electorate advised the government. There was never and has never been a debate in our parliament on that advice. It was just assumed that because that 37% represented as 51.89% of actual votes cast, that settled the matter. And so now we have this, what I would think personally, I'm not going to disguise my view about the matter, but I think absolute debacle of Brexit, already doing a great deal of damage, dividing our country, creating all sorts of problems. It has never been discussed whether 37% of the electorate's advice was sufficient for so dramatic and massive a constitutional change as we are struggling our way through now at the moment. And this is an example of the fact that at the time that the referendum happened, one of the parties had a majority in Parliament. The Conservative Party did under David Cameron. I want you to notice something really interesting about the 2 years between the 2017 general election of Theresa May and the 2019 general election of Boris Johnson. In those 2 years, what we saw was a hung Parliament. What we saw was Parliament doing what Parliament should be existing for, namely, holding the executive to account on every single step that the executive takes. Everything that the executive sought to do in those 2 years was challenged and had to stand or fall on its particular merits, not because there was a majority that could automatically vote it through, but because it had to pass the test of scrutiny in Parliament. Those 2 years between 2017 and 2019 show us what our legislature should be and what its relationship to the executive should be. That is how things should work. If you have a proportional system of representation, you're almost certainly going to get a need for coalition governments, because you're almost certainly not going to get any single party having an overall majority. It hardly ever happens. But that's an excellent thing, because once coalitions have been worked out, compromises have to be reached, a common platform has to be formulated, and in general, the outcome is likely to be, as we see in the examples of places like Germany and the Netherlands, on the whole, rather sensible public policy, which acts in the interests of the people, government for the people, a service to the people. One of the things I argue in my book is that government should transcend politics. Government should not be a matter of political action in the interests of one side of the argument. It should be a service. And this entails a number of other things. It doesn't mean, by the way, that they shouldn't be politics. Of course they should be. People should put forward ideas, discuss them and challenge them and debate them. The public conversation should be about that, about the direction of travel of the country. The hustings, election time should be about policy matters. But once the people in a truly representative electoral system have expressed their range of preferences and interests, then the people they have delegated as their representatives have to come together and say, right, well, how are we going to work together to deliver the best of what we've all got to offer? And that is indeed what happens in some of the countries I've mentioned, and which doesn't happen here. There are lots and lots of other things to be said about this. I mean, we think of the fact that in the first past the post system with two parties, two main parties, the whipping system, the careerism of MPs. I mean, there are some people who've sat in the House of Commons for decades, never having held any kind of ministerial position, or even indeed sat on a select committee. and just lobby for it, just voting as the whips tell them to vote. If you could do away with the whip system, then instead of representing the party line, which is what MPs almost always do, they would be representing the interests of our country and of their constituents. If you put a term on MPs' careers, you can only serve as an MP for one parliament, for example, that would absolutely put an end to the whipping system and to careerism, because then MPs would be genuinely independent, which is what they should be, and what they used to be back in the 18th century and in the early part of the 19th century, before the party system came into being in response to the increasing democratization of the system. So there's a good deal to be said about all the other things that are implied when we think about the concept of democracy. And of course, I try to explore them in the book. But the main lines of my argument are as I've just described them. Democracy is government by the people. That means of as many people who can be sensibly enfranchised as possible, representing the great range of views that there are in our society. So a proportional system of representation, and government, when it is formed after those preferences and choices have been made by the people, should be an institution of service to the people. And I end now on the thought also that I really, really do think that the time has come that we should codify our arrangements, at very least that part of our constitutional structure, which deals with elections, which deals with the powers and the limits of powers of the executive, the duties of the legislature, and which makes very clear the separation and independence of the judiciary vis-a-vis both the executive and parliament. A point that I make, by the way, because as you know, our current government is contemplating limiting the competence of the judiciary to hold the government to account when it oversteps itself, as it has twice done in recent years in a very serious way. One was in the triggering of Article 50. Remember, there was the Gina Miller case in the Supreme Court, and the other was on the prorogation of Parliament last year, when the Supreme Court had to say that what the government was seeking to do was unconstitutional. Now our government wants to limit the competence of the courts to do that. That's a political interference in the independence of the judiciary, and we need a constitution which will protect the judiciary against interference by a highly partisan government at any point in the future. So these points, by the way, all of them are urgent and practical points. And perhaps as a final thing I could therefore say is this. It seems to me that we the people, should be urging all the opposition parties, Labour, Lib Dems, Plaid, Greens, SNP, should urging them all to come together on a platform for electoral reform. That is the key. I would advise, don't argue for reforming everything all at once, to reform elections, reform the House of Lords, reform the monarchy, reform this, that, and the other, because if you chuck the kitchen sink in there, nothing will get done. The keystone of the arch here, the key thing is electoral reform. Now, as it happens, all the opposition parties other than Labour have agreed with one another to work together on a common platform for electoral reform. We hear very promising noises from the Labour Party to the same effect, and let us hope that they will do this. I mean, I think a very frank self-assessment by Labour would suggest to them that without Scotland, they will never again form a majority in Parliament. While Scotland votes for the SNP, Labour is not going to get a majority. Therefore, if it went for proportional representation, it could be the senior party in coalition governments, which would be of, I think, very great benefit to our country. But there is a key thing, a real test of commitment on the part of the Labour Party in this connection. And that is that the Labour Party would have to suspend or abolish that clause in its constitution, which requires it to field a candidate in every constituency. Because if it does that, then it would get in the way of candidates from other parties who have a more realistic chance than Labour of winning in a given constituency. In order to get that common platform, it really does have to be common. And then we could imagine, here is a dream, that all the parties, the opposition parties, unite to do this. They educate the public on this matter. And they win the argument. They form a coalition government after the next election, which will be, what, in 2 or 3 years' time. They then institute a new electoral system. Then we have a parliament which is elected on a proportional basis. And then that parliament puts the question back to us about what we want our relationship with the European Union to be. And in that dream scenario, and a dream scenario for me, we would not only have begun the very, very necessary process of reforming our constitutional arrangements and our political order in the UK, we might even have preserved the UK as the integrity of it, and we may even be rejoining the EU, and this could all be happening sometime in the next 5 to 8 years. Well, that might end on an optimistic dream. Perhaps not all of you agree with that, but certainly I do hope that you agree with the point that our parliamentary system is not delivering democracy. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Professor Grayling. That's a brilliant talk. And of course, if your interest at home has been piqued, The Good State is available at your local independent bookstore, Warwick Books, in Market Square. Thank you for listening again, and enjoy the rest of the festival.